A young woman lies perfectly still, wrapped tightly inside a rolled carpet, carried on the shoulder of a single trusted servant through the torchlit halls of a palace that, by every right of blood and birth, already belongs to her. Somewhere ahead, in a private chamber lit by oil lamps, the most powerful man in the entire known world sits reviewing reports from a war she did not start, but must somehow survive. She has risked capture, exile and death simply to reach this room unseen, unrolled at last and unveiled before he even has time to ask who let her in. This is Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, and tonight, across the next unhurried hour and a half, we are going to follow her entire life. From a palace in Alexandria to this daring, unlikely meeting and far beyond it, told so slowly and so gently that long before we reach the end, you will already be asleep. Welcome back to Boring History Narrative. If sleep is what brought you here tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. We are travelling this time not into the world of gods and monsters, but into genuine documented history, ancient Egypt in its final chapter, to walk alongside a queen remembered for her intelligence, her political daring, and a love story that would eventually help end an entire dynasty. You do not need to stay awake for a single word of what follows. Let your body settle into the bed beneath you. Let your breathing slow. Your only task tonight is to listen for as long as you're able, and to drift away the moment your mind is ready to. Before we begin, take one slow breath in, and let it go even slower than it came. Feel your shoulders loosen. Feel the weight of your whole body sink a little further into stillness. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight, and nothing else you need to do except rest and listen, while this story carries you gently the rest of the way towards sleep. If stories like this one help you unwind at the end of a long day, consider subscribing to Boring History Narrative before you drift off tonight. It costs nothing, takes only a moment, and means a new slow, unhurried story will already be waiting for you the next time your mind is too loud to settle on its own. And if you'd like, leave a single word in the comments before you go, wherever you're listening from tonight, just so we know how far this story has travelled to reach you. Now, let your eyes close if they haven't already, and let us step back, away from that rolled carpet for now, back several years earlier, to a palace beside the sea, and a young girl growing up inside one of the most remarkable and most dangerous royal families the ancient world ever produced. Rest now, and let this long, remarkable story begin. Cleopatra was born in the city of Alexandria, likely in the year 69 before the Common Era, into a royal family known as the Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's own trusted generals, a man named Ptolemy, who had claimed Egypt for himself after Alexander's sudden death nearly 3 centuries earlier. By the time Cleopatra was born, this same family had ruled Egypt for generation after generation, a genuinely Greek dynasty governing an ancient Egyptian kingdom, maintaining, across nearly 300 years, a curious blend of Greek culture at court and traditional Egyptian religious and royal tradition among the wider population they governed. Alexandria itself, the city Cleopatra called home for her entire life, was unlike almost anywhere else in the ancient world, a planned, cosmopolitan capital built directly on Alexander the Great's own orders, home to the legendary Library of Alexandria, a lighthouse so famous it was counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and a population that mixed Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and countless other Mediterranean communities together within a single bustling, prosperous port city. It is worth imagining for a moment exactly what it must have felt like to grow up as a young princess inside this particular city, surrounded not by the older, more traditional temples further up the Nile, but by wide paved streets, grand harbour views, and the constant lively hum of merchants and scholars from across the entire known world. Cleopatra's own father, King Ptolemy XII, ruled during a genuinely difficult and unstable period for Egypt, his own throne frequently threatened both by internal family rivalry and by the looming ever-present influence of Rome, whose growing power across the Mediterranean world made every remaining independent kingdom increasingly nervous about its own long-term survival. Ptolemy himself was not a particularly popular or effective ruler by most ancient accounts, and was forced into exile at least once during Cleopatra's own childhood, fleeing to Rome itself to seek support for reclaiming his throne, a political reality that would have shaped young Cleopatra's earliest understanding of power considerably, watching firsthand just how fragile even a royal family's claim to their own throne could genuinely be. It was during these same uncertain years that Cleopatra received what ancient sources consistently describe as a genuinely remarkable education, one considerably more thorough and more varied than most royal women of her era typically received anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. Let's go back for a moment, too, to Cleopatra's own family history. Before we continue any further tonight, because the Ptolemaic dynasty's own particular character deserves a slower telling than we've given it so far. This family, descended from one of Alexander the Great's own most trusted generals, had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years by the time Cleopatra herself was born, maintaining across that entire span a genuinely unusual cultural position, Greek in language and court custom, yet ruling over an ancient Egyptian population whose own religious and cultural traditions stretch back thousands of years before any Ptolemy had ever arrived in Egypt at all. Many earlier Ptolemaic rulers had made only limited effort to genuinely engage with Egyptian culture and religion, beyond what was strictly necessary to maintain their own political legitimacy, presenting themselves formally as pharaohs in the traditional Egyptian religious sense, while continuing to speak and think in Greek terms privately among themselves. Cleopatra, by contrast, appears to have taken a genuinely different approach, and ancient sources specifically note that she was the first Ptolemaic ruler in nearly 3 centuries to actually learn the Egyptian language fluently, a detail that reveals something meaningful about how she understood her own role and her own relationship with the wider population she governed. It is worth sitting with this particular detail for a moment, a ruler choosing genuine engagement with her subjects' own culture and language rather than simply the minimum formal gesture her position required. Egyptian religious texts and temple inscriptions from her own reign frequently depict her using traditional pharaonic imagery and titles, presenting herself deliberately as a genuine continuation of Egypt's own ancient pharaonic tradition rather than simply another foreign Greek ruler governing from a comfortable distance. This particular choice likely reflected both genuine personal interest and careful political calculation, understanding that securing genuine loyalty from her Egyptian subjects, not just her own Greek court, would prove essential to her own long-term political survival in an era of genuinely mounting external pressure from Rome. Ancient historians, including Plutarch, whose writings remain one of our most valuable surviving sources about her entire life, describe Cleopatra as fluent in numerous languages, a genuinely unusual and impressive achievement for any ruler of that era. Greek and Egyptian both, along with, according to some accounts, Hebrew, Aramaic, Ethiopian, and several other languages spoken across the different peoples and territories within Rome's expanding sphere of influence. This particular skill mattered enormously for a ruler in her position, allowing her to communicate directly with foreign dignitaries and with her own diverse Egyptian subjects without needing a translator standing between them, a genuinely rare and politically valuable ability that set her apart considerably from most other Ptolemaic rulers before her, many of whom, across nearly 3 centuries of Greek rule in Egypt, had never bothered learning the Egyptian language of the very kingdom they governed at all. Beyond languages, Cleopatra's education likely included careful study of mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and administration, the practical and intellectual foundations any capable ruler of that era would have needed to genuinely manage a wealthy, complex kingdom rather than simply inherit its throne in name alone. It is worth imagining for a moment the particular atmosphere of the Alexandrian royal court during these years. Scholars and tutors drawn from the nearby library and its associated research institution, the Maution, offering a young princess access to genuinely one of the greatest concentrations of accumulated knowledge anywhere in the ancient world. This combination of genuine intellectual capability and careful political education would prove absolutely essential once Cleopatra herself finally came to the throne, inheriting not simply a kingdom, but an entire tangled web of family rivalry, foreign pressure, and genuine existential uncertainty about whether Egypt, the very last major independent kingdom remaining from Alexander the Great's fractured empire, could possibly continue surviving much longer at all. Squeezed as it increasingly was between its own internal instability and Rome's steadily growing hunger for new territory and new wealth across the entire Mediterranean world. Let's spend a little more time, too, with the Library of Alexandria itself before we continue any further tonight, because this remarkable institution shaped the entire intellectual atmosphere Cleopatra grew up within and deserves its own fuller telling. Founded generations earlier by Cleopatra's own ancestors, the library aimed, according to ancient accounts, at nothing less than gathering a complete copy of every significant written work across the entire known world, employing teams of scholars specifically tasked with acquiring, copying, and translating texts from Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian, and countless other languages and traditions. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbour were reportedly required by long-standing royal policy to surrender any books aboard for copying by library scholars before their owners could reclaim the originals, a policy that, whatever its practical inconvenience for individual travellers, helped the library accumulate what ancient sources describe as several 100,000 individual scrolls, a genuinely staggering concentration of accumulated human knowledge unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. Scholars associated with the library and its neighbouring research institution made genuine, significant contributions across mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and countless other fields, several of their discoveries and calculations remaining remarkably accurate even by later, considerably more advanced scientific standards. It is worth imagining, for a moment, exactly what it must have meant for young Cleopatra to grow up within easy walking distance of this remarkable institution. Access to accumulated knowledge that few other rulers anywhere in the ancient world could have matched. Scholars and tutors drawing directly on the library's vast collected resources to shape her own considerable education. This particular advantage, access to genuinely the finest accumulated knowledge available anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, likely shaped her own later political and diplomatic skill considerably. A ruler whose careful strategic thinking benefited directly from an educational foundation few of her contemporaries, Roman or otherwise, could have possibly matched. Let's spend a little more time too with the particular texture of daily life within the Alexandrian royal court during Cleopatra's own childhood, before we continue any further tonight, because it deserves a slower telling than we've offered so far. Ancient royal courts of this era typically involved elaborate daily ceremony, formal audiences, religious observances tied to both Greek and Egyptian tradition, and constant careful attention to the shifting alliances and rivalries among the various officials, advisors, and extended family members surrounding any reigning monarch. For a young princess like Cleopatra, this meant growing up thoroughly immersed in careful political observation from an early age, learning to read the subtle signals of court favour and disfavour long before she ever formally held any power of her own. It is worth imagining for a moment exactly what kind of careful, watchful intelligence this particular upbringing must have cultivated in her. A childhood spent constantly observing the careful maneuvering of adults around her, learning which alliances held genuine substance and which merely offered convenient, temporary advantage, absorbing gradually the same kind of patient political wisdom that would later serve her so effectively in her own dealings with Caesar, with Antony, and eventually, though less successfully, with Octavian himself. This particular kind of childhood, formerly privileged but genuinely demanding in its own quiet way, required a careful balance most of us can likely recognize in our own lives too. Whatever our own particular circumstances happen to be growing up, the accumulated wisdom that comes from careful, patient observation, absorbed gradually over years rather than taught through any single deliberate lesson. Whatever careful wisdom your own childhood quietly taught you, absorbed the same slow, patient way, still shapes how you move through your own life today. The same way Cleopatra's own careful childhood observation continued shaping her remarkable political career for her entire adult life. Let's slow down for a moment here, the way we will several times tonight, and let this part of the story settle a little more gently before we continue. If your mind is already beginning to drift, that is exactly as it should be. Feel your breathing slow, in through the nose, easy and unhurried, and out even slower still. There is no test waiting at the end of tonight's story. Nothing you need to hold on to tightly. Let it move through you the way warm water moves through open hands, most of it slipping quietly away, only a little of it needing to stay. If this kind of unhurried storytelling is helping you settle tonight, remember that a comment costs nothing either, and it genuinely helps a small channel like this one reach more tired minds who need exactly this kind of slow, gentle company late at night. Now, let's continue gently into the difficult years that finally brought Cleopatra to her own throne. When Ptolemy XII died in the year 51 before the Common Era, his throne passed jointly, according to his own final wishes and to long-standing Ptolemaic royal custom, to Cleopatra, then only about 18 years old, and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was still only around 10. This particular arrangement, a brother and sister ruling jointly, sometimes even married to each other in name, to preserve the appearance of pure royal bloodline, reflected an old, distinctly Ptolemaic tradition, one that had already produced considerable family conflict across previous generations of this same dynasty, and would very quickly produce exactly the same kind of conflict for Cleopatra and her young brother too. It is worth pausing here for a moment, imagining what it must have felt like for an 18-year-old woman, however capable and well-educated, to suddenly find herself co-ruler of one of the wealthiest, most strategically important kingdoms in the entire ancient world, sharing that same throne with a child barely old enough to understand the genuine political dangers already surrounding them both. Cleopatra, from nearly the very beginning of this joint rule, appears to have moved quickly to establish her own independent authority, issuing official documents and appearing on temple inscriptions without her young brother's name attached at all, a bold, deliberate assertion of her own primary claim to power that unsurprisingly did not sit well with the advisors and court officials surrounding her brother, who had their own considerable interest in seeing the young king rule without his older sister's shadow looming so directly over him. This growing tension between Cleopatra and her brother's court advisors eventually escalated into genuine open conflict, and by the year 48 before the Common Era, Cleopatra found herself forced out of Alexandria entirely, driven into exile by her brother's supporters, who now controlled the throne, the palace, and the young king himself, using his own name and authority as a convenient shield for their own considerable political ambitions. Cleopatra, rather than simply accepting this defeat, retreated instead to the region of Syria, where she began the difficult, patient work of raising her own military force, determined to reclaim the throne she genuinely believed belonged to her by right. It was during this same turbulent period that an entirely separate, equally significant conflict was unfolding across the wider Roman world, one that would soon collide directly with Cleopatra's own struggle in ways she could not yet have anticipated. Rome itself was in the middle of a devastating civil war. Two of its most powerful generals, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, locked in open conflict for control of the entire Roman state, a conflict that had already spread across the Mediterranean, drawing in allied kingdoms and client states, Egypt very much included. Whether they genuinely wanted involvement in Rome's own internal struggle or not, Pompey, defeated decisively by Caesar at a major battle in Greece, fled toward Egypt seeking refuge, believing, reasonably enough given Egypt's long-standing alliance with his own family, that young King Ptolemy's court would offer him safety and support. Instead, Ptolemy's advisors, calculating coldly that offering Caesar the head of his defeated rival might win them considerable favour, with Rome's clearly ascendant new power, had Pompey murdered almost immediately upon his arrival on Egyptian shores, presenting his severed head to Caesar himself when he arrived in Alexandria, shortly afterward pursuing his fleeing rival. It is worth pausing here for a moment, sitting with the genuine brutality and cold political calculation of that particular decision, one that, rather than winning Caesar's favour as Ptolemy's advisors had hoped, instead appears to have genuinely disgusted him. Caesar reportedly weeping at the sight of his former ally and one-time friend's severed head, understanding immediately that whatever advisors now controlled young Ptolemy's court were capable of a ruthlessness that made them, in his own careful political calculation, considerably less trustworthy than whatever alternative Egyptian leadership might exist instead. Let's spend a little more time, too, with Julius Caesar's own remarkable career before his arrival in Alexandria, before we continue any further tonight, because understanding exactly who Cleopatra was dealing with helps illuminate just how significant her own political achievement in securing his support genuinely was. By the time Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing his defeated rival Pompey, he was already, by most accounts, the single most accomplished military and political figure in the entire Roman world, having conquered vast new territories across Gaul, in what is now France and parts of surrounding regions, and having already survived and won Rome's own recent brutal civil war against Pompey's own considerable forces. Caesar was, in other words, no ordinary foreign visitor for Cleopatra to navigate, but genuinely the most powerful individual anywhere in the entire Mediterranean world at that particular moment, a man whose personal favour or disfavour could reshape the fortunes of entire kingdoms in a single decision. That Cleopatra managed, through a combination of careful planning, genuine personal courage, and considerable intelligence, to secure not simply his political support but his genuine personal partnership, reveals just how remarkably skilled she genuinely was at exactly this kind of high-stakes political navigation, understood correctly even by ancient writers who were not always inclined to view her particularly favourably given the genuine cultural biases many Roman sources carried against foreign, and specifically female, political power. It is worth sitting with this particular context for a moment. A young queen, barely 21 years old at the time of that first dramatic meeting, successfully securing the personal and political backing of history's most accomplished contemporary military leader, achieved not through military force, which she genuinely lacked in sufficient quantity at that particular moment, but through careful intelligence, genuine personal courage, and a clear understanding of exactly how to present herself and her own kingdom's genuine value to a man who had already conquered most of what he had ever set his mind toward conquering. Let's spend a little more time, too, with the wider geopolitical situation across the eastern Mediterranean during Cleopatra's own early reign, before we continue any further tonight, because understanding this broader context helps illuminate just how genuinely precarious Egypt's own independent position actually was by the time she inherited her throne. Across the previous several decades, Rome had steadily absorbed one after another of the various successor kingdoms that had emerged from Alexander the Great's own fractured empire, until Egypt remained, by Cleopatra's own time, essentially the last genuinely significant independent power remaining from that entire once vast Hellenistic world. This particular situation placed enormous, constant pressure on Egypt's own rulers, requiring careful, continuous diplomatic navigation simply to maintain nominal independence rather than being formally absorbed as a Roman province, moving so many neighbouring kingdoms already had been. Cleopatra's own father had already been forced into humiliating dependence on Roman support to reclaim his own throne during one of his periods of exile, borrowing heavily from Roman lenders in the process. Debts that continued burdening Egypt's own royal treasury well into Cleopatra's own subsequent reign. It is worth sitting with this particular pressure for a moment. Understanding Cleopatra's entire political career not simply as a series of dramatic personal relationships, but as an ongoing, genuinely difficult balancing act, maintaining her own kingdom's independence and prosperity against the steady, seemingly inevitable pressure of Rome's expanding influence, achieved for as long as it was achieved through remarkable skill rather than through any particularly favourable underlying circumstances. Her eventual defeat, viewed through this wider lens, reflects less a personal failure, and more simply the final chapter of a genuinely difficult, decades-long struggle that ultimately proved impossible for any single ruler, however skilled, to prevent indefinitely against Rome's overwhelming and steadily growing power. Let's rest here a while too, in this quiet space, before we continue any further into tonight's story. Picture Alexandria's royal palace at the particular hour just before dawn, the sky slowly beginning to lighten over the harbour, the great lighthouse's beacons still burning against the fading darkness. The palace itself still mostly quiet, only the earliest household staff beginning their own daily preparations. There is a specific, gentle stillness available in exactly this kind of quiet early hour. The whole busy world of court politics and diplomatic manoeuvring not yet fully awake and stirring. Let that same gentle stillness settle over you now too, wherever you happen to be resting tonight. If tonight's unhurried pace continues easing you towards sleep, remember that boring history narrative always builds its stories exactly this way, patient and layered. A comment or a subscribe before you fully drift off helps this small channel keep bringing exactly this kind of unhurried company to more tired minds who need it. Let's spend a little more time too with the wider Roman civil war context surrounding Caesar's own arrival in Egypt, because it deserves fuller explanation before we continue. Rome's own republican system had been under increasing strain for decades by this point, ambitious generals commanding personally loyal armies rather than forces genuinely loyal to the Roman state itself. A dangerous combination that had already produced several earlier rounds of internal Roman conflict before Caesar and Pompey's own eventual confrontation. Caesar's decisive victory over Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece effectively ended organised resistance to his own growing authority, though scattered pockets of opposition, including some of Pompey's own surviving supporters, would continue resisting for several more years across various parts of the Roman world. Let's spend one more quiet moment too, with the particular relationship between Cleopatra and her wider Ptolemaic ancestors' own troubled family history, because it deserves a fuller telling before we continue. Across the nearly three centuries of Ptolemaic rule preceding her own reign, this same family had produced a genuinely remarkable pattern of internal conflict. siblings and even parents and children frequently turning against one another in disputes over succession and power, sometimes with genuinely violent consequences that would have been well known to Cleopatra, from her own family's carefully remembered history even before her own conflict with her brother ever began. It is worth sitting with this particular inherited pattern for a moment, understanding that Cleopatra's own eventual conflict with her brother Ptolemy XIII, however genuinely difficult and dangerous it proved for her personally, reflected a considerably older, well-established family pattern rather than any particularly unusual or unprecedented family breakdown. Growing up within a family whose own history included so many similar struggles likely prepared her, in its own difficult way, for the genuine political dangers she would eventually need to navigate herself. An inherited awareness that royal power, even within one's own immediate family, could never be taken entirely for granted or assumed safely secure without constant, careful vigilance. Let this same understanding settle over you gently now, as tonight's story continues its slow journey forward, the reminder that we often carry forward, whether we fully recognize it or not. Patterns and lessons inherited from our own family's longer history, shaping how we navigate our own particular challenges in ways that connect us across however many intervening years or generations. To those who came carefully, patiently before us, let's spend one final quiet moment too with the particular geography surrounding Alexandria itself before we continue, because it shaped so much of the wider strategic picture Cleopatra had to navigate throughout her entire reign. The city sat at the very edge of the Nile Delta, positioned deliberately along the Mediterranean coast rather than further inland along the river itself, giving it direct, easy access to maritime trade routes connecting Egypt to Greece, to Rome, and to the wider Mediterranean world, while the Nile Delta's own fertile farmland stretched out behind it, providing the enormous agricultural wealth that made Egypt so consistently valuable to outside powers. This particular geographic position offered genuine strategic advantages, easy access to trade and diplomatic communication with the wider world, but it also meant Alexandria itself remained genuinely vulnerable to naval attack and blockade, a vulnerability that became painfully clear during both the Alexandrian War against her brother's forces and, years later, during Octavian's own final approach toward the city. It is worth sitting with this particular tension for a moment, a capital city whose very location, chosen deliberately for its trading advantages generations before Cleopatra's own birth, also carried within it the seeds of genuine strategic vulnerability that would eventually contribute to her kingdom's final downfall. Let this same thought settle over you gently now. The reminder that the very same qualities that make something genuinely valuable and prosperous often carry, alongside that value, their own particular vulnerabilities too, a pattern worth recognizing gently in our own lives as well. Wherever our own particular strengths might also carry, quietly alongside them, their own corresponding areas of genuine exposure, Caesar, now present in Alexandria with a Roman military force at his own command, positioned himself as a kind of arbiter in the ongoing dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, summoning both siblings to appear before him to formally settle their competing claims to the Egyptian throne. This presented Cleopatra with a genuinely difficult practical problem, since her brother's forces controlled Alexandria itself, and simply attempting to enter the city and the palace openly would have exposed her to immediate arrest or worse, before she ever had the chance to actually present her case to Caesar directly. It was this exact practical problem that led to the daring solution we opened tonight's story with, Cleopatra arranging to be smuggled into the palace and directly into Caesar's own private quarters, reportedly concealed inside a rolled carpet or bed sack carried by a single trusted servant, avoiding her brother's guards entirely by relying on nothing more elaborate than clever, careful planning and considerable personal courage. When that carpet was finally unrolled before him, Caesar found himself looking directly at a determined young queen who had risked genuine, serious danger simply for the opportunity to present her own case in person, rather than allowing her brother's advisors to control the entire narrative in her absence. Ancient historians differ on exactly how much of Caesar's subsequent decision to support Cleopatra's claim reflected genuine political calculation, recognizing her intelligence and capability as a more reliable ally than her brother's clearly ruthless advisors versus genuine personal attraction, the two of them reportedly beginning a romantic relationship not long after this dramatic first meeting. Most modern historians studying this period suggest the truth likely involved both considerations intertwined together: political advantage and genuine personal connection rarely existing entirely separately from each other, particularly among rulers whose every personal relationship inevitably carried significant political weight as well. Whatever the precise mixture of motivations involved, Caesar's support for Cleopatra's claim triggered immediate, serious conflict with her brother's own forces, a conflict that would soon become known as the Alexandrian War, fought partly within the city of Alexandria itself, drawing Caesar's own relatively small Roman force into genuinely dangerous urban fighting against considerably larger Egyptian numbers. Let's rest here a while too, before we continue. In the quiet space just after that dramatic first meeting, there is a particular kind of steady courage worth sitting with for a moment. A young woman choosing genuine, serious personal risk over simply waiting passively for others to decide her own fate for her. If any part of your own recent days required a similar kind of quiet courage, choosing to act rather than simply wait, let that same steady resolve rest alongside you now too. If tonight's story continues easing you towards sleep, remember that a subscribe or comment before you drift off genuinely helps this small channel keep bringing new, unhurried journeys through history every single week. Now, let's continue gently into the difficult conflict that followed, and its eventual decisive resolution. The Alexandrian War, fought across several difficult months, proved genuinely dangerous for Caesar's own forces, at one point requiring him to burn a portion of his own fleet in Alexandria's harbour to prevent it falling into enemy hands, a fire that ancient accounts suggest may have damaged nearby portions of the city, including, according to some later, disputed accounts, some structures near the famous library itself, though the precise extent of any damage to the library's actual collections remains genuinely debated among historians even today. Eventually, with reinforcements arriving from allied territories, Caesar's forces gained the decisive advantage, and young Ptolemy XIII was killed during the fighting, reportedly drowning in the Nile while attempting to flee the battle's final defeat. With her brother dead and Caesar's military support firmly behind her, Cleopatra was formally restored to the Egyptian throne, now ruling jointly, according to Ptolemaic tradition's continued insistence on some appearance of shared rule, alongside her considerably younger remaining brother, Ptolemy XIV, though genuine practical authority now rested almost entirely in her own capable hands. It is worth pausing here for a moment, noticing just how dramatically Cleopatra's own circumstances had shifted across these difficult months. From exile and genuine personal danger to secure, Rome-backed control of her own kingdom, achieved through a combination of careful political calculation, genuine personal courage, and an alliance with the single most powerful man in the entire Roman world. In the months that followed the war's resolution, Cleopatra and Caesar are said to have taken an extended journey together along the Nile, travelling deep into Egypt's ancient heartland, visiting temples and monuments already many centuries old even in their own era. A genuinely remarkable journey through a civilization whose recorded history already stretched back further than most other cultures either of them could easily comprehend. It is worth imagining for a moment what that particular journey must have felt like, floating slowly along the world's longest river, ancient pyramids and temples rising periodically along its banks. The most powerful man in Rome, touring the accumulated monuments of a civilization that had already been ancient and established long before Rome itself existed at all. During this same period, Cleopatra gave birth to a son, whom she named Ptolemy Caesar, though he became more widely known by the affectionate nickname Caesarion, meaning Little Caesar, a name that made his paternity, and the political implications carried within it, entirely unmistakable to anyone across the Mediterranean world paying attention to Egyptian and Roman affairs. Caesar himself, back in Rome, never formally acknowledged Caesarion as his legitimate son and heir under Roman law, a legal complication that would carry significant, difficult consequences in the years still ahead. But the boy's existence, and Cleopatra's own relationship with the most powerful man in Rome, was widely known and widely discussed across the ancient world, regardless of any formal Roman legal recognition. Cleopatra eventually travelled to Rome herself, along with young Caesarion, staying for an extended period as Caesar's guest, a genuinely remarkable and controversial presence within the city, a foreign queen, mother to Caesar's own son, residing openly during a period when Caesar's own political position within Rome remained genuinely complicated and contested. Roman writers of the period, and later historians drawing on their accounts, often described public reaction to her presence with a notable mixture of fascination and considerable unease. An independent foreign queen wielding genuine influence over Rome's own most powerful figure, representing exactly the kind of foreign entanglement many traditional Roman senators had long viewed with deep, genuine suspicion. Let's spend a little more time too with the city of Alexandria itself before we continue any further tonight, because it deserves a fuller description than we've given it so far. Ancient Alexandria was organised around two enormous sheltered harbours, protected in part by a small island called Pharos, upon which stood the city's famous lighthouse, a structure so tall and so remarkable for its era that ancient writers counted it among the seven wonders of the world, its light said to be visible to ships approaching from many miles out at sea, guiding merchant vessels safely into harbour from across the entire Mediterranean world. The royal palace complex itself, where Cleopatra spent nearly her entire life, occupied a substantial portion of the city along the eastern harbour, a sprawling collection of connected buildings, gardens and private quarters that, according to ancient descriptions, rivaled or exceeded the grandest palace complexes anywhere else in the ancient world. Nearby stood the library and its associated mausoleum, drawing scholars from across the entire Mediterranean and Near Eastern world to study and work among what was, by every ancient account, the single greatest collection of accumulated written knowledge anywhere on Earth at that time. It is worth imagining for a moment growing up as a young princess within this particular setting, surrounded not simply by wealth and royal privilege, but by genuine, concentrated intellectual and cultural achievement. Scholars debating philosophy and mathematics within easy walking distance of the palace itself. Merchants and travellers arriving daily from Rome, Greece, Judea, and countless other distant lands, bringing with them news, goods, and ideas from across the entire known world. This particular environment, cosmopolitan and intellectually rich in ways few other ancient cities could genuinely match, likely shaped Cleopatra's own worldview considerably, exposing her from earliest childhood to a genuinely international perspective that would serve her well throughout her own later diplomatic dealings with Rome and with other foreign powers across her entire reign. Let's rest here a while too, in this quiet space, before we continue any further into tonight's story. Picture that same city now, at the particular hour just after sunset, the great lighthouse's beacon, just beginning to catch and hold the fading light, harbour waters, settling into their own quiet evening stillness, the day's busy commerce slowly giving way to the different, gentler rhythms of evening across the wider city. There is a specific gentle stillness available in exactly this kind of grand ancient harbour city at dusk, ships resting quietly at anchor, warm lamplight beginning to glow in windows across the palace and the wider city alike. Let that same gentle stillness settle over you now too, wherever you happen to be resting tonight. If tonight's unhurried pace continues easing you towards sleep, remember that boring history narrative always builds its stories exactly this way, patient and layered, more interested in these gentle, quieter textures than in rushing past them toward the next dramatic event alone. A comment or a subscribe before you fully drift off helps this small channel keep bringing exactly this kind of unhurried company to more tired minds who need it. Now, let's continue gently into the sudden, dramatic turn that would soon reshape Cleopatra's entire political situation once again, an event that occurred not in Alexandria at all, but in Rome itself, on a spring day that would become one of the most consequential single moments in the entire history of the ancient world. Let's spend one more quiet moment too, with the particular quality of Cleopatra's own relationship with her wider family before her father's death, because it deserves a fuller telling before we continue any further tonight. Ancient sources suggest Cleopatra was likely her father's favourite among his several children, and some historians believe she may have served as his own informal advisor or co-regent during at least the final portion of his own troubled reign, gaining genuine practical governing experience well before she formally inherited the throne herself. This particular early involvement in genuine governance, rather than simply ceremonial royal upbringing alone, likely explains a great deal about the confidence and capability she displayed so immediately once she finally did assume formal power herself. It is worth imagining for a moment exactly what that early practical experience must have looked like. A young princess present during genuine council discussions, observing and perhaps even contributing to real decisions about taxation, foreign relations, and the countless other practical matters any functioning kingdom required careful attention to. This kind of early, genuine practical involvement, rather than simply distant ceremonial observation, likely gave her a considerable advantage over many other royal heirs across the ancient world, who often received primarily formal education without genuine hands-on experience until the moment they actually inherited power themselves, sometimes with genuinely difficult consequences when that inexperience collided with the immediate practical demands of actual rule. Let this same thought settle over you gently now. The reminder that genuine capability often grows most reliably, not from formal instruction alone, but from real, hands-on experience, gradually accumulated through actual practice and actual responsibility. The same patient way Cleopatra's own remarkable political skill grew steadily across years of genuine involvement in her own family's difficult governing challenges, long before the wider world ever had reason to notice her own considerable capability for itself. Let's spend one final quiet moment too, with Egypt's own ancient pharaonic tradition Cleopatra inherited and consciously drew upon, before we move on toward the middle chapters of tonight's story, because this deep, layered history deserves a slower telling. By the time Cleopatra herself was born, Egypt's own recorded pharaonic history already stretched back nearly 3,000 years, encompassing the construction of the Great Pyramids, countless earlier dynasties, and an accumulated religious and cultural tradition of genuinely staggering depth and complexity. Cleopatra, in presenting herself formally as a continuation of this ancient tradition, was consciously connecting her own reign to an inheritance considerably older and considerably more significant than even Rome's own comparatively recent rise to power. It is worth sitting with this particular scale for a moment. The genuine weight of ruling as the inheritor, however indirect through her own Greek Ptolemaic lineage, of one of the oldest continuous civilizations anywhere in the ancient world. Temple inscriptions from her reign show her performing traditional Egyptian religious ceremonies, and ancient Egyptian priests continued recording her reign using the same traditional formal conventions they had used to record pharaohs stretching back millennia before her own birth, a genuine, formal continuity linking her own remarkable dramatic life to an inheritance of truly staggering historical depth. Let this same sense of deep historical continuity settle over you gently now, as tonight's story continues its slow journey forward, the reminder that even the most dramatic individual life, filled with genuine political upheaval and personal drama, still exists within a much longer, much deeper current of history, continuing steadily onward both before and after it, the same patient, accumulating way Egypt's own ancient civilization continued flowing forward, generation after generation, long before Cleopatra's own remarkable chapter began, and long after it eventually, inevitably came to its own close. There is one more small detail worth adding here too, something about the particular timing of Cleopatra's own reign relative to the wider ancient world around her, worth sitting with for just a moment before we continue. She was, remarkably, closer in time to our own modern moon landing than she was to the construction of Egypt's own Great Pyramids, those enormous monuments already standing as genuinely ancient relics of a distant, half-legendary past even during her own lifetime, thousands of years already separating her own era from theirs. It is a strange, quietly fascinating thought to sit with for a moment now, the particular vastness of Egypt's own accumulated history, so deep that even Cleopatra herself, standing at what feels to us now like the very edge of the ancient world, was already looking back across an almost incomprehensible span of earlier human history stretching out behind her own already remarkable life. There is one more small detail worth adding here too, before we move fully into the heart of tonight's story. Something about the particular weight carried by that single word, Pharaoh, that Cleopatra held as the final ruler to genuinely claim it in the ancient Egyptian tradition's own original sense. After her death, no other ruler would ever again govern Egypt as a formerly independent pharaonic kingdom, rooted in that same ancient, unbroken tradition. Every ruler of Egypt from that point forward, for the remainder of ancient history, would govern instead as part of some larger foreign empire, Roman, and eventually Byzantine, Arab, and Ottoman rule, following in turn across the many centuries afterward. Let this same quiet weight settle over the story now, as we prepare to follow it through every remaining chapter tonight, a woman who carried, whether she fully understood it in these exact terms herself or not, the genuine final chapter of one of history's longest and most remarkable civilizations. In March of the year 44 before the Common Era, Julius Caesar was assassinated in Rome, stabbed to death by a group of Roman senators who believed, whether accurately or not, that his growing personal power represented a genuine existential threat to Rome's own long-standing republican traditions. Cleopatra, still present in Rome at the time along with young Caesarion, found herself suddenly and dramatically vulnerable, her closest political ally, and the father of her only son now dead, and Rome itself plunged immediately into fresh political chaos as various factions began maneuvering for control of Caesar's now vacant position of enormous influence and power. Cleopatra departed Rome quickly, returning to Alexandria as swiftly as she safely could, understanding immediately just how precarious her own position, and Caesarion's own uncertain future, had suddenly become without Caesar's direct personal protection and patronage. Back in Egypt, she moved decisively to secure her own throne further, and shortly after her return, her remaining younger brother and nominal co-ruler, Ptolemy XIV, died under circumstances ancient sources describe with considerable suspicion. Many historians since suggesting Cleopatra may have arranged his death herself, to eliminate any remaining rival claim to her own throne, and to clear the way for young Caesarion to be formally recognized as her own co-ruler instead. It is worth pausing here for a moment, sitting honestly with this particular difficult episode in Cleopatra's own story. A reminder that her genuine intelligence and political skill existed alongside the same ruthless calculation that defined nearly every surviving royal house across the ancient world during this particular era. Family members eliminated not from any personal cruelty alone, but from the same cold political necessity that had, just a few years earlier, seen her own brother's advisors murder Pompey, the moment his presence became more liability than asset. Cleopatra's own survival and her own dynasty's continued survival depended entirely on her willingness to make exactly these kinds of difficult, sometimes genuinely troubling decisions, a reality worth holding honestly alongside her more admirable qualities as this long story continues unfolding tonight. Rome itself, in the years immediately following Caesar's assassination, descended into another prolonged period of civil conflict, as competing factions fought to determine who would eventually inherit Caesar's own considerable political influence and authority. Two figures eventually emerged as the dominant forces within this new struggle: Octavian, Caesar's own great-nephew and formerly adopted heir, still remarkably young but already displaying the same careful, patient political calculation that would eventually make him one of history's most successful rulers, and Mark Antony, an experienced military commander who had served loyally under Caesar for many years and who initially held considerably more immediate practical power and popular support than his younger rival. For a time, these two men, along with a third less influential partner, governed the Roman world jointly through an arrangement known as the Second Triumvirate, dividing responsibility for different portions of Rome's vast territory between themselves, while working together, at least initially, to hunt down and eliminate Caesar's original assassins and to stabilize Rome's own continued internal governance. Mark Antony, in this arrangement, took primary responsibility for Rome's eastern territories, a region that inevitably brought him into direct, significant contact with Egypt, still the wealthiest and most strategically important independent kingdom remaining anywhere in the entire eastern Mediterranean world. This is exactly where we'll pause for now, at the very edge of a new chapter in Cleopatra's remarkable story, Rome's own internal power struggle about to bring an entirely new and equally consequential figure directly into her own life. We will follow that story and everything that follows from it in the next part of tonight's journey together. For now, let your own breathing settle further, slow and unhurried. If your mind has been drifting in and out through this first part of tonight's story, a palace beside the sea, a rolled carpet, a river journey along the Nile, that is exactly as it should be. Let the details blur softly now, present but no longer something you need to hold on to tightly. If tonight's story is helping ease you towards sleep, a quick subscribe before you fully drift off means a new slow, unhurried journey through history will always be waiting for you here at Boring History Narrative. Rest here a while longer now, before we continue together in the next part of tonight's story. There is one more small thought worth carrying into this transition too: the reminder that every genuinely significant political alliance in Cleopatra's own life began with exactly this same combination: careful preparation on her part meeting genuine, unpredictable circumstance on the wider world's part, a pattern that would repeat itself once more in the chapter still waiting ahead. Welcome back to Boring History Narrative, and to the second part of tonight's slow journey through the life of Cleopatra. If you're joining partway through, or drifting back in after resting through part of the last section, that's perfectly fine. We left Rome in the aftermath of Caesar's assassination, divided now between two rival powers, Octavian and Mark Antony, with Antony taking responsibility for Rome's eastern territories. a region that would soon bring him into direct, world-changing contact with Cleopatra herself. Let's rejoin the story there now gently, and continue together. In the year 41 before the Common Era, Mark Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus, in what is now southern Turkey, intending, according to most ancient accounts, to question her about Egypt's own role, or perceived lack of sufficient support during the recent campaign against Caesar's assassins. Rather than arriving as a nervous supplicant appearing before a powerful Roman commander, Cleopatra chose instead to arrive in a manner calculated to completely reshape the entire dynamic of their meeting from the very first moment. She sailed up the river toward Tarsus aboard an extravagantly decorated barge. Its sails reportedly dyed a deep, expensive purple, its deck arranged to evoke images of the goddess Venus, surrounded by attendants dressed as mythological figures. The whole spectacle accompanied by music and incense drifting across the water as she approached. Ancient accounts, including Plutarch's own detailed description, written considerably later, but likely drawing on earlier, contemporary sources suggest the entire population of Tarsus turned out to witness her arrival, drawn away even from Antony's own official audience by the sheer spectacle unfolding along the riverbank. It is worth pausing here for a moment, sitting with the genuine political brilliance of this particular entrance, Cleopatra transforming what could easily have been a difficult, subordinate meeting into a dramatic display of her own wealth, sophistication, and cultural power, ensuring that Antony and the entire watching city understood immediately that whatever conversation followed would occur between two genuinely significant powers meeting as something closer to equal, rather than a Roman commander simply summoning a dependent foreign ruler to explain herself. Let's spend a little more time, too, with the political context that made Mark Antony such a genuinely significant figure across the Eastern Mediterranean during this period. Before we continue any further tonight, because his own considerable stature helps explain why Cleopatra's careful, dramatic approach to their meeting at Tarsus mattered so significantly. Antony had served Caesar loyally for many years, commanding significant military forces during Caesar's own campaigns, and had emerged, following Caesar's assassination, as one of the two most powerful men remaining in the entire Roman world, controlling vast military resources and, through his role within the Second Triumvirate, formal authority over Rome's entire eastern territories, a region that included Egypt's own immediate neighborhood and represented enormous strategic and economic significance for Rome's own continued stability and expansion. For Cleopatra, securing genuine partnership with a figure of Antony's considerable standing represented, in practical terms, continued security for her own kingdom and her own throne, protection against the numerous other regional powers and potential rivals who might otherwise have viewed Egypt's own considerable wealth as an inviting target now that her earlier protector Caesar was gone. It is worth understanding their eventual partnership through exactly this lens, alongside whatever genuine personal connection also developed between them, a careful, high-stakes political alliance between two of the most significant figures anywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world, each bringing genuine value to the other: Antony's military and political authority, Cleopatra's own kingdom's enormous wealth and strategic resources. This particular combination of genuine personal connection intertwined with careful political calculation appears repeatedly throughout Cleopatra's entire adult life, and it is worth sitting with for a moment now, the reminder that even our most significant relationships often carry multiple layers of meaning simultaneously, practical benefit and genuine personal connection existing together rather than as separate, easily distinguished categories, a pattern true across countless different lives and circumstances, not simply within the particularly high-stakes world of ancient royal politics alone. Let's spend one more quiet moment too with the particular symbolism Cleopatra deliberately invoked during her famous entrance at Tarsus, before we continue any further tonight, because it deserves fuller explanation. By presenting herself in the visual guise of the goddess Venus, known to Egyptian tradition under the closely associated identity of Isis, Cleopatra was making a genuinely deliberate, carefully calculated statement, positioning herself not simply as a foreign queen seeking Roman favour, but as something closer to a living embodiment of divine feminine power meeting Antony, who had in turn cultivated his own public association with the god Dionysus, god of wine, fertility and ecstatic celebration. This particular combination, Venus or Isis meeting Dionysus, carried genuine religious and symbolic weight for audiences across the ancient Mediterranean world, evoking imagery of divine union and cosmic harmony that went considerably beyond simple political theatre alone. It is worth sitting with this particular layer of meaning for a moment, understanding that ancient political spectacle of this kind operated simultaneously on multiple levels. Practical political messaging intertwined carefully with genuine religious and cultural symbolism that would have resonated deeply with audiences steeped in exactly this kind of shared mythological and religious tradition. Cleopatra's own careful attention to exactly this kind of symbolic presentation appears consistently throughout her entire reign. Coins, temple inscriptions, and public ceremony all carefully crafted to reinforce her own particular claimed identity, part traditional Egyptian pharaoh, part Hellenistic Greek monarch, part, in moments like this dramatic entrance at Tarsus, something approaching genuine living divinity itself. Its careful, deliberate cultivation of her own public image reveals, once again, just how genuinely sophisticated her political understanding truly was. Recognizing that effective rule required not simply competent administration, but careful, deliberate attention to exactly how that rule was perceived and represented to the wider world watching it unfold. Whatever initial political tension had drawn Antony to summon Cleopatra to Tarsus in the first place, the meeting quickly developed into a genuine personal and political partnership. Antony travelling to Alexandria himself not long afterward, where the two of them spent an extended period together, and where Cleopatra eventually gave birth to twins, a son and a daughter, whom she named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, names deliberately invoking the sun and the moon, a clear, deliberate statement about the kind of grand cosmic significance she intended their shared partnership and their children's own future roles to eventually carry across the wider Mediterranean world. Antony, meanwhile, continued balancing his relationship with Cleopatra against his own ongoing political obligations back in Rome, including, for a period, a formal marriage to Octavian's own sister, Octavia, arranged specifically to help stabilize the increasingly strained relationship between himself and his younger rival within their shared triumvirate. This particular arrangement created an obviously complicated and eventually unsustainable personal situation, Antony maintaining for several years a formal Roman marriage alongside his ongoing, increasingly public relationship and shared children with Cleopatra in Alexandria, a tension that both Octavian and increasingly hostile factions within Rome itself would eventually exploit ruthlessly for their own political advantage. Eventually, Antony's relationship with Octavia collapsed entirely, and he returned to Alexandria and to Cleopatra permanently, a decision that, whatever genuine personal feeling motivated it, carried enormous political risk, given how easily his Roman rivals could portray his continued devotion to Cleopatra as evidence of dangerous foreign influence, corrupting a Roman leader's proper judgment and loyalty. It is worth sitting with this particular tension for a moment, a genuinely significant historical figure caught between personal devotion and political necessity, choices that, made differently, might well have led toward an entirely different outcome for both himself and for Cleopatra's own long-term political survival. Let's slow down here for a while, the way we did throughout the first part of tonight's story, and rest a little longer before we continue. There is a particular kind of complicated tenderness worth sitting with in the story we've just walked through. Personal devotion tangled together with political necessity in ways that rarely resolve as cleanly or as simply as we might wish. If your own life has ever carried a similarly complicated tangle of personal feeling and outside pressure, let yourself rest gently with that complexity now too, rather than needing to resolve it into anything simple or tidy tonight. If tonight's slower, more thoughtful pace continues easing you towards sleep, remember that boring history narrative uploads a new story exactly like this one every single week, always this same unhurried, careful pace. A comment sharing your own thoughts, however brief, genuinely helps this small channel understand what kind of company its listeners are looking for late at night. Now let's continue gently into the political arrangement that would eventually give Antony's Roman rivals exactly the ammunition they needed. In the year 34 before the Common Era, in a ceremony held in Alexandria that came to be known by later historians as the Donations of Alexandria, Antony formally granted Cleopatra and her children extensive territories across the eastern Mediterranean, declaring Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, to be Caesar's legitimate heir and co-ruler of Egypt alongside his mother, while granting their other children significant additional territories across the wider region, including parts of what is now Syria, Cyprus, and various other eastern territories under Antony's own considerable Roman authority. News of this ceremony, when it eventually reached Rome, proved genuinely devastating to Antony's own political reputation there, easily portrayed by Octavian and his allies as clear evidence that Antony had abandoned proper Roman priorities entirely, distributing Roman territory as personal gifts to a foreign queen and her children, and elevating Caesarion's claim in a way that directly threatened Octavian's own carefully cultivated position as Caesar's sole legitimate political heir. Octavian used this genuine political opportunity skillfully, portraying the coming conflict not as another difficult round of Roman civil war, which Roman citizens had already grown genuinely exhausted by after so many years of internal conflict, but instead as a unified Roman campaign against a dangerous foreign queen who had, in Octavian's own careful propaganda, corrupted a genuinely capable Roman leader and now threatened Rome's own security and traditional values. This particular framing proved politically brilliant, allowing Octavian to rally broad Roman support behind what was, in genuine practical terms, still fundamentally another chapter of Rome's own ongoing internal power struggle. War was formally declared, not directly against Antony as a fellow Roman citizen, which would have reopened uncomfortable memories of recent civil conflict, but specifically against Cleopatra herself, a framing that allowed Octavian to present the entire coming conflict as a matter of Roman unity against foreign threat, rather than simply another difficult round of Roman fighting Roman. Antony, choosing to stand alongside Cleopatra rather than abandon her to save his own Roman standing, found himself effectively drawn into this same framing. His own forces and Cleopatra's combined resources preparing together for what would become one of the most consequential naval confrontations in the entire history of the ancient Mediterranean world. The decisive confrontation came in September of the year 31 before the Common Era, at a naval battle fought near Actium, along the western coast of Greece. Octavian's forces, under the skilled command of his trusted General Agrippa, proved decisively superior in the actual fighting, and partway through the battle, Cleopatra's own fleet withdrew from the engagement entirely, followed shortly afterward by Antony himself, who abandoned his own remaining forces to follow her, a decision ancient historians have debated the true motivations behind for centuries since, some suggesting genuine tactical retreat, others suggesting something closer to personal devotion, overriding careful military judgment at exactly the wrong, most consequential moment. Let's spend a little more time, too, with Octavian himself, before we continue any further tonight, because understanding his own particular character and approach helps illuminate exactly why Cleopatra's careful strategies, which had worked so successfully with both Caesar and Antony, ultimately proved unable to secure the same kind of favourable outcome with him, where Caesar had been drawn partly by genuine admiration for boldness and capability, and Antony by a combination of political calculation and genuine personal warmth. Octavian, still remarkably young, but already displaying the careful, patient, and often genuinely cold political calculation that would eventually make him, under his later title Augustus, one of history's most successful and longest reigning rulers, approached the entire conflict with Cleopatra through a considerably more calculated, considerably less personally engaged lens. Octavian understood, with genuine clarity, exactly what political value defeating Cleopatra held for his own broader ambitions, unifying Roman public opinion behind a foreign campaign rather than another uncomfortable round of Roman civil war, eliminating Caesarion's genuinely threatening claim to Caesar's own legacy, and securing Egypt's enormous wealth directly for his own now unified control over the entire Roman world. Cleopatra's own considerable charm and political skill, which had worked so effectively with two previous Roman leaders, appears to have made genuinely little impression on Octavian himself, whose own careful calculation left little room for exactly the kind of personal connection her earlier strategies had successfully relied upon. It is worth sitting with this particular contrast for a moment, the reminder that even genuinely remarkable skill and capability, proven successful again and again across an entire career, will not necessarily succeed against every single circumstance or every single person encountered along the way. Cleopatra's ultimate defeat reflects not any sudden failure of her own considerable ability, but simply the genuine, particular difficulty of facing an opponent whose own approach to power differed so fundamentally from the two men whose favour she had so skillfully won before him. Let's spend a little more time too with Egypt's own considerable economic and agricultural strength during Cleopatra's reign, before we continue any further tonight, because it explains a great deal about why Rome found the kingdom so consistently valuable and so consistently worth pursuing, whether through alliance or eventual conquest. The Nile's annual flooding cycle, remarkably predictable and remarkably fertile compared to most agricultural regions across the ancient Mediterranean world, made Egypt one of the single productive grain-growing regions anywhere in the entire ancient world, a genuine agricultural abundance that translated directly into enormous royal wealth and enormous strategic value for whichever power ultimately controlled it. Cleopatra herself took a genuinely active, hands-on role in managing this considerable economic resource. Ancient sources describing her direct involvement in economic policy and administration, in ways that went well beyond the more purely ceremonial role many other ancient monarchs, male and female alike, typically maintained. Surviving administrative documents from her reign reveal a ruler genuinely engaged with the practical details of governing her kingdom, careful attention paid to tax policy, grain distribution, and the countless other practical administrative matters required to keep a genuinely wealthy, complex kingdom functioning smoothly across her entire reign. It is worth sitting with this particular detail for a moment. A ruler remembered popularly today largely for her dramatic political relationships, who was, in genuine historical fact, also a remarkably capable and engaged administrator, personally attentive to the practical economic foundations that made her kingdom's continued wealth and influence genuinely possible in the first place. This particular combination, genuine romantic and political drama, alongside careful, competent day-to-day governance, offers a considerably fuller and more accurate picture of her actual life and reign than the more simplified, dramatic version that has often dominated popular retellings across the centuries since her death. Let's rest here a while too, before we continue toward the final, most difficult chapters of tonight's story. There is a particular kind of heaviness worth sitting with in this moment, a battle whose outcome would ultimately determine not just a single military campaign, but the entire future shape of the ancient Mediterranean world, decided partly, according to the old accounts, by decisions made under genuine pressure and uncertainty, rather than through any perfectly clear, carefully calculated strategy. If today asked something similarly difficult of you, some decision made under genuine pressure that you're still turning over now, let yourself set that weight down for a moment tonight. Whatever was required of you today has already happened. There is nothing more it needs from you right now, only rest, unhurried and complete. If tonight's story continues easing you towards sleep, remember that a subscribe or comment costs nothing at all, and genuinely helps this small channel keep bringing slow, gentle stories like this one to more tired minds who need them. Now let's continue gently into the final months of Cleopatra's remarkable life, and the difficult, sorrowful conclusion this long story has been quietly moving toward, following their defeat at Actium. Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, where they spent their final months together attempting, with steadily diminishing hope, to rally whatever remaining resources and alliances might still allow them to resist Octavian's now clearly overwhelming momentum. Octavian pursued them steadily across the following months, and by the summer of 30 before the Common Era, his forces had finally reached Alexandria itself, Cleopatra's own capital city now under direct immediate threat for the first time in her entire reign. As Octavian's forces closed in on the city, a confused report reached Antony, suggesting that Cleopatra had already died, in some tellings a genuine miscommunication, in others a deliberate message Cleopatra herself arranged, perhaps hoping to somehow ease the immediate crisis, or perhaps in her own genuine despair at their rapidly collapsing situation, simply losing careful control over how information was being managed during those final chaotic days. Antony believed in the report and, unable to imagine continuing without her, took his own life and was carried, still living but mortally wounded, to Cleopatra, who had taken refuge in a heavily guarded mausoleum she had prepared in advance, where he died in her presence shortly afterward. It is one of the most genuinely tragic moments in all of ancient history, worth sitting with gently for a moment now, rather than rushing past it toward the story's final chapter. Two people who had built an entire shared political and personal partnership across more than a decade, undone finally by a single tragic miscommunication, arriving at exactly the worst possible moment, when clearer information might have changed the entire remaining course of both their lives. Cleopatra, now facing Octavian directly, attempted her own careful, familiar political strategy, meeting with him personally in hopes of negotiating some continued position for herself and, most urgently, for her children, particularly Caesarion, whose claim as Julius Caesar's own son represented the single greatest remaining threat to Octavian's own carefully cultivated position as Caesar's sole legitimate political heir. These negotiations, by every ancient account, proved unsuccessful. Octavian, understanding clearly that Caesarion's continued existence represented a genuine, lasting threat to his own authority, made clear, whether directly or through his own careful actions in the days that followed, that Cleopatra's throne, and quite possibly her own life and her children's lives, held no secure future under his own continued rule. Let's spend one more quiet moment, too, with the broader historical significance of the Battle of Actium itself, before we continue any further tonight, because its consequences extended well beyond Cleopatra and Antony's own personal story. This particular naval engagement effectively ended the long era of Roman civil wars that had, in one form or another, consumed the Roman world for the better part of a century, and cleared the way for Octavian's own subsequent transformation of Rome from a republic into what would become, under his later title Augustus, the Roman Empire, an entirely new form of government that would go on to shape the entire subsequent course of Western history for centuries afterward. It is worth sitting with this particular weight for a moment, understanding that the naval battle we discussed earlier tonight was never simply a contest between two ancient lovers and their Roman rival, but genuinely one of the most consequential single military engagements in the entire history of Western civilization, its outcome determining not just Cleopatra's own personal fate, but the entire subsequent political structure of the Roman world for the following several centuries. Historians studying this period consistently identify Actium as one of history's genuine turning points, a single afternoon's naval engagement that effectively determined whether Rome would continue as a republic, however troubled, or transform permanently into the centralized imperial system that Augustus would soon establish and that his successors would maintain for centuries to come. Let this same weight settle over you gently now too, as tonight's story continues moving toward its own quiet close. The reminder that individual human stories, however personal and however intimate they might feel from the inside, sometimes carry consequences that ripple outward across an entire civilization's future. The same way a single afternoon's battle off the coast of Greece continued shaping the world for centuries after the actual fighting itself had long since ended. Understanding the genuine hopelessness of her own remaining position, and determined, according to the old accounts, not to be paraded through Rome's streets as a captured trophy, in Octavian's inevitable victory celebration, Cleopatra took her own life on the 12th of August, in the year 30 before the Common Era, ending both her own remarkable life and, with it, nearly 3 centuries of continuous Ptolemaic rule over Egypt, and considerably longer than that, if counted from Egypt's own far older pharaonic tradition, stretching back thousands of years before the Ptolemies had ever arrived at all. The exact manner of her death has been debated by historians for centuries since, the most famous ancient account, again from Plutarch, describing her allowing an asp, a venomous Egyptian snake, to bite her, a method some modern historians consider unlikely on purely practical grounds, while others suggest she may have used some other poison entirely, self-administered privately within her own carefully guarded chamber. What every ancient source agrees on, regardless of the precise method, is that her death was a deliberate, carefully chosen act, a final assertion of her own agency and control over her own story's ending, refusing to allow Octavian, or Rome itself, to determine how her own remarkable life would ultimately conclude. It is worth sitting with this final choice for a moment now, gently, as tonight's long story moves toward its own close. A woman who had spent her entire adult life navigating genuinely difficult political circumstances through careful intelligence, personal courage, and strategic alliance, choosing in her own final moment to maintain that same fundamental control over her own fate, rather than allowing someone else to write the final chapter of her story for her. Let's rest here a while too, before we move toward the final closing chapters of tonight's story. Bring your attention gently to your own breath, and let it slow, unhurried, easy. There is no urgency required in your own rest tonight either. Let your shoulders soften. Let your hands rest loosely, holding nothing. If tonight's slow, careful telling of a genuinely difficult ending is still resting heavily with you. Know that this same gentle sorrow is worth simply sitting with for a moment, rather than needing to resolve immediately. Not every story tonight has needed to end in triumph for it to still be worth hearing slowly, carefully, all the way through. If tonight's unhurried pace continues easing you towards sleep, a subscribe or comment before you drift off genuinely helps this small channel keep bringing exactly this kind of careful, thoughtful company to more tired minds every week. Following Cleopatra's death, Octavian moved quickly to secure his own complete control over Egypt, and Caesarion, the greatest remaining threat to his political legitimacy, was executed shortly afterward on Octavian's own direct orders, ending, with genuine finality, any remaining claim connecting Julius Caesar's own bloodline to continued political power. Egypt itself was formally annexed as Roman territory, no longer an independent kingdom at all, but a Roman province. Its enormous agricultural wealth, particularly its grain production along the Nile, now flowing directly into Rome's own treasury and food supply, a resource that would prove genuinely significant to Rome's own continued stability for centuries afterward. Cleopatra and Antony's three surviving children, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, along with their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome, where they were raised, remarkably, in the household of Octavia, Antony's former Roman wife, who showed them, according to ancient accounts, genuine care despite the complicated, painful history connecting their two families. Cleopatra Selene eventually married a North African king and became a genuinely significant ruler herself, carrying her mother's own remarkable legacy forward into an entirely new chapter in an entirely different kingdom across the following generation. Let's spend one truly last quiet moment too, with Caesarion's own brief, sorrowful place in this entire remarkable story, before we finally completely close it tonight. He was, by most ancient accounts, still only a teenager at the time of his death, a young man whose entire brief life had been shaped almost entirely by his parents' own extraordinary political circumstances, carrying within him a claim to power so significant that it ultimately cost him his life before he ever had the genuine chance to live one of his own choosing. It is worth sitting with this particular sorrow gently for a moment now, a reminder that history's grandest political dramas often carry within them these quieter, more personal tragedies too. Young lives shaped and ultimately ended by circumstances entirely beyond their own choosing or control. Let's spend a little more time too with the surviving physical evidence of Cleopatra's own reign before we continue any further tonight, because it offers a genuinely useful counterbalance to the more dramatic, romanticized portrayals that dominate popular imagination today. Ancient coins minted during her reign survive in reasonable numbers and offer historians one of the most reliable contemporary sources available for understanding how she genuinely wished to be perceived and represented, rather than relying entirely on later Roman writers whose own accounts inevitably carried their own particular biases and political motivations. These surviving coins typically depict her with a strong, prominent nose and a firm, determined jawline, a portrayal that differs considerably from the idealized romantic beauty often emphasized in later artistic and popular depictions, suggesting that her genuine historical reputation and influence rested considerably more on her intelligence, political skill, and personal charisma than on conventional physical beauty alone, a detail ancient writers themselves occasionally noted directly, several describing her particular charm as emerging primarily from her conversation, her wit, and the sheer force of her personality, rather than from her physical appearance specifically. It is worth sitting with this particular detail for a moment, a genuinely important correction to popular imagination's frequent oversimplification of her story into primarily a tale of romantic seduction and physical beauty. The real historical Cleopatra, based on the most reliable contemporary evidence available to us, was remembered by those who actually knew her personally for her genuine intelligence, her remarkable linguistic ability, and her considerable political skill, qualities considerably more substantial and considerably more worth remembering than simple physical beauty alone ever could have been. Let's spend a little time now, too, with how Cleopatra's own reputation and legacy have shifted and evolved across the more than 2,000 years since her death, because this particular afterlife of her story reveals almost as much about the different eras retelling it as it does about Cleopatra herself. Roman writers of the generation immediately following her death, working under Octavian's own now secure rule as the Emperor Augustus, tended to portray her in genuinely unflattering terms, emphasizing supposed excess and foreign danger, a portrayal that served Augustus's own political interests considerably more than it reflected any careful, balanced historical assessment of her genuine capability as a ruler. Later centuries continued reshaping her story according to their own particular interests and assumptions. Renaissance and later European artists and writers often emphasizing dramatic romance and tragedy above her genuine political and administrative achievements, while modern historians, drawing on a considerably wider range of evidence, including her own surviving official documents and coinage, have worked to recover a more balanced, more accurate picture. A genuinely capable ruler who spoke numerous languages, managed a complex, wealthy kingdom through genuinely difficult circumstances, and navigated Rome's overwhelming power through careful, often remarkably successful, diplomatic and personal alliance, rather than simple military resistance alone. It is worth sitting with this particular pattern for a moment. The way a single genuinely complex historical figure can be reshaped so dramatically across different centuries, each era finding in her story whatever meaning best served its own particular assumptions and interests. Perhaps the truest, most honest way to hold her story now, this far removed from any of those competing interpretations, is simply to recognize her as she likely was, extraordinarily capable, genuinely intelligent, navigating one of history's most difficult political positions with considerable skill for as long as circumstances allowed her to. Let's spend one final quiet moment, too, with how Cleopatra's own story has continued shaping art, literature, and popular culture across the many centuries since her death, before we settle into tonight's closing rest. Because this particular endurance deserves its own slower telling. William Shakespeare's own famous play, written many centuries later, brought her story to English-speaking audiences in a form that continues being performed and studied today, emphasizing the genuine dramatic power of her relationship with Antony in ways that shaped popular Western imagination about her life for generations of audiences who might never have encountered the original ancient historical sources directly. Countless painters across the centuries since have returned repeatedly to key moments from her story, her dramatic barge journey to meet Antony at Tarsus, her final moments, her meetings with Caesar, each generation of artists finding their own particular meaning and their own particular visual language for retelling essentially the same remarkable layered story. This same pattern of continued, evolving artistic and cultural engagement with her life reveals something meaningful about why certain historical figures continue captivating attention across such enormous spans of time. Genuine intelligence and political skill combined with genuine personal drama and tragedy, offering each new generation something worth returning to and reinterpreting according to their own particular concerns and their own particular understanding of what her remarkable story ultimately means. Let this same sense of continued, evolving fascination settle over you gently now, as tonight's long journey through her entire remarkable life finally draws toward its close. The reminder that some stories simply continue finding new audiences, new interpretations, and new relevance across enormous spans of time, the same way her own particular story, first lived out along the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean more than 2,000 years ago, continues finding its way, even now, into a quiet room where a tired listener is finally, gently drifting toward sleep. Let's spend one more quiet moment, too, with the particular fate of the Ptolemaic dynasty's own remaining historical legacy after Cleopatra's death, before we settle finally into tonight's closing rest, because it deserves a fuller telling. While Egypt itself became a Roman province, and no direct Ptolemaic descendant would ever again rule there, the family's own bloodline continued forward through several of Cleopatra's surviving children and grandchildren, eventually intermarrying with various other Mediterranean and North African royal families across the following generations. A genuine, if scattered and complicated, biological legacy continuing to ripple outward across the ancient world, long after the formal Ptolemaic kingdom itself had ceased to exist. Egypt itself, once absorbed into Roman control, continued serving as one of the empire's most economically significant provinces for centuries afterward, its enormous grain production continuing to feed Rome's own growing population and helping stabilize the broader Roman economy well into the following centuries. It is worth sitting with this particular continuation for a moment. The same fertile land and the same remarkable river that had sustained Egypt's own independent civilization for thousands of years continuing afterward to sustain an entirely different empire's needs, the physical landscape itself enduring steadily onward, even as the particular political structures governing it shifted dramatically across the passing centuries. Let this same sense of enduring continuity settle over you gently now, as we finally completely draw tonight's long story toward its close, the reminder that landscapes and rivers and the deep, patient rhythms of the natural world tend to outlast even the most dramatic human political upheaval, the same steady, patient way the Nile itself continues flowing today, thousands of years after Cleopatra herself once travelled along its waters. Let's spend one final quiet moment too, with the genuinely difficult question of how historians actually know what we know about Cleopatra's own life, before we settle completely into tonight's closing rest, because it deserves honest, careful acknowledgement. Nearly all of our surviving, detailed accounts of her life come from Roman writers working after her death, often under the rule of Augustus himself or his immediate successors, meaning our understanding of her remains genuinely shaped by sources with their own particular political motivations for portraying her in certain ways rather than others. Modern historians work carefully to read these ancient sources critically, cross-referencing them against surviving physical evidence, coins, inscriptions, administrative documents, and archaeological findings, working patiently to separate genuine historical fact from later political embellishment or bias. This particular challenge, common across much of ancient history, but especially pronounced in Cleopatra's own case, given how directly her story intersects with Augustus's own carefully cultivated political narrative, means our understanding of her continues evolving even now, as historians and archaeologists uncover new evidence and reconsider old assumptions with fresh, more careful scholarly attention. Let this same honest acknowledgement settle over you gently now, as tonight's very long story finally truly comes to rest, the reminder that even genuinely well-documented historical figures remain, in important ways, still partly mysterious to us, their full genuine complexity filtered through centuries of retelling, bias, and gradual historical reconsideration. Whatever version of Cleopatra's remarkable story tonight has carried you through, know that it represents our own best current, careful understanding, offered gently and honestly, the same unhurried way every story on this channel is offered to you. There is one truly final small detail worth adding here too. Something about the particular way Cleopatra's own name has continued echoing forward into modern life, in ways that reach far beyond any casual awareness of her actual history. Used today for everything from scientific naming conventions to countless products and brands invoking her name specifically to evoke luxury, sophistication, and a certain enduring, timeless glamour. It is a remarkable kind of everyday endurance for a name to achieve, carried forward across more than 2,000 years, still recognized instantly nearly everywhere in the world, still carrying within it echoes of a genuinely remarkable woman who once navigated some of the most consequential political currents in the entire ancient world with intelligence, courage, and a fierce, unwavering determination to hold on to her own kingdom and her own story for as long as she genuinely could. Let's spend a little more time too with what modern archaeology has actually managed to uncover about her genuine physical world before we settle into tonight's closing rest, because it offers its own quiet, fascinating layer worth sitting with. Much of ancient Alexandria, including significant portions of the royal palace complex, where Cleopatra likely spent most of her own life, now lies beneath the waters of Alexandria's own harbour, gradually submerged over many centuries by earthquakes, rising sea levels, and slow geological shifts along the Egyptian coastline. Modern underwater archaeologists have spent decades carefully exploring these submerged ruins, recovering statues, architectural fragments, and other genuine physical remnants of the very world Cleopatra herself once walked through. It is a remarkable, quietly moving thought to sit with for a moment. An entire palace complex, an entire vanished chapter of the ancient world, resting now beneath calm harbour waters, occasionally yielding some new fragment or discovery to patient modern researchers working carefully through its submerged remains. No confirmed tomb or burial site for Cleopatra herself has ever been definitively located, despite considerable ongoing archaeological effort, adding one final layer of genuine historical mystery to a life already filled with dramatic, carefully documented events. Let this same thought settle over you gently now, as tonight's long story finally draws toward its close. An entire remarkable life, extensively documented in some ways and genuinely mysterious in others, resting now, quite literally in places, beneath calm, patient water, waiting the same unhurried way so much of ancient history waits, for careful attention and careful telling to bring it gently back into the light. Let's slow all the way down now, for these final few minutes of tonight's long layered story. Think back, if you'd like, one final time tonight, to that rolled carpet carried quietly through torchlit palace halls. A young queen unrolled before the most powerful man in the entire ancient world, everything still uncertain ahead of her. She could not have known, in that particular moment, everything still waiting across the years still ahead, a war fought within her own city's streets, a son named for the most powerful man in Rome, a barge sailing up a river dressed as a living image of a goddess, twins born from a partnership that would eventually reshape the entire Mediterranean world, and finally, a quiet, deliberate choice made in her own final private moment, refusing to let anyone else write the ending of her own remarkable story. None of us, standing at the edge of our own uncertain futures, can ever fully know what still waits ahead, either. We can only make the same careful, courageous choices Cleopatra herself made again and again across her entire remarkable life, gathering whatever alliance and support genuinely available to us, meeting difficulty with intelligence and patience rather than simply raw force alone, and holding on to whatever measure of control over our own story remains genuinely within our own hands. There is nothing more this story is going to ask you to follow closely now. Let your breathing settle into its own slow, natural rhythm. Let your whole body sink heavier into the bed beneath you, the same unhurried heaviness that settles over any long story finally reaching its end. If your mind is still holding on to small pieces of tonight's journey, a carpet unrolled in torchlight, a barge dressed as a goddess sailing up a quiet river, let them soften now, blurred gently at the edges, the way every detail eventually blurs on the way toward true, deep rest. If tonight's story helped ease you towards sleep, remember that Boring History Narrative uploads a new one, exactly like this every single week, always this same slow, unhurried pace. Always built for exactly this moment, late at night, mind finally slowing down after a long day. A subscription costs nothing at all, and means a new story will always be waiting the next time you need one. There's no need to remember any of tonight's details by morning. No need to do anything else at all, except let this be the last thing your mind holds on to tonight well. Rest completely, and good night. Rest well tonight, carrying nothing but the quiet, settled weight of a very long, remarkable life, finally completely told. Good night, truly, from Boring History Narrative.